Hi, I'm George Norrie, and welcome to our Coast to Coast AM YouTube channel. Have fun, tell your friends, and share us with everyone. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Coast to Coast AM's mobile app. And always remember to log on to our website at coasttocoastam.com for daily articles, the best paranormal information, and all you need to know about your favorite guests. And now you can become a Coast Insider directly through the Coast mobile app. We welcome our international listeners and even offer a free 2-week trial. So don't delay. Become an insider today. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. Richard Lawrence back with us. Very few have campaigned longer than Richard has for the truth about UFOs. Recent amazing revelations from our government and sources have vindicated Richard, and he is the executive secretary for the Aetherius Society for Europe and Africa, which happens to be the oldest UFO contactee organization in Britain, possibly the world. He's an advanced psychic, channeler, and student of Master of Yoga and ET contactee Dr. George King. He has written many books, including UFOs and the Extraterrestrial Message. He was last on with me about a year ago. Richard, welcome back. How have you been?
Oh, great, George. It's really good to say good morning, because it is morning there, I think, just as well as here.
Well, here where I am in Los Angeles, it's midnight.
Just after, yeah. So you're just starting morning in a way. But anyway, it's great to talk to you again, George. How are you keeping? I'm doing fine, thanks.
Everything's great. What did you think of our government's UFO hearings before Congress?
Very significant indeed. And as a matter of fact, I've got to say this and put my hands up so you could teach us over here in Europe a lesson. The British government, who I am appealing to at the moment to do something, and the politicians over here are absolutely pathetic compared to, I suppose, a small number it is really, isn't it, George, of your Democrat and Republican politicians over there. And we hear about it, and it's okay. It's not everything we want, by the way. They haven't got the disclosure even that they want, but it's real progress. It is great news.
What did you think of the testimony of the 3 former military folks?
I thought it was excellent. I thought it was extremely credible. I watched it from beginning to end. And I thought that the things that particularly David Grush, but also the other 2 being so highly qualified, particularly Commander Fravor, just can't be ignored. I mean, he was clear, Commander Fravor, that, with all his experience as a U.S. Navy pilot and so forth, he wasn't into UFOs at all before this, or UAPs, as they've kind of rebranded it, haven't they, really, as UAPs, but I think we're still calling them UFOs pretty much. He was absolutely clear that they have such incredible capabilities. Funnily enough, actually, I wrote a book called Contacts with the Gods from Space with the late Dr. George King, and in that book we put some of the capabilities of UFOs in detail that have been coming out now quite recently. With your U.S. Navy video clips and with some of the things that those 2 witnesses said. But of course, David Grush, the other witness, he was the one who came up with the most contentious and significant revelations, I think.
Why do you think he said so many things publicly, and then the real good stuff, he said, I have to talk to you privately behind closed doors? That
was frustrating, wasn't it?
It was.
And it's absolutely clear-cut proof of the cover-up, isn't it? I mean, it was open and on display for all to see, and they all acknowledged it, including the congressmen and women, that we're going to have to go into a silent meeting to talk about this. The public, we can't tell them. And that's, of course, what certainly we in the Aetherius Society have been saying for decades. I mean, I was bringing actually CIA papers over to Britain in the 1980s, which confirmed that in there, actually, one of the interesting questions I thought, George, was by one of the congressmen who asked about the capacity of UFOs to disarm an American jet. I don't know if you picked up on that. And that's quite significant because it shows their powers, but it also shows that they're peaceful because they didn't fire back. They knew what this American jet was going to do. They just disarmed it. Now, that's not new. These papers I brought back in the 1980s They're CIA papers they're published in my book, UFOs and the Extraterrestrial Message. They show that a weapons control panel was disabled by a UFO as soon as that jet got into missile range of it. As soon as it got out of range, the weapons control panel was activated. So these are supernormal powers. These, as Commander Fravor said, it's a physics we don't have on Earth.
Richard, do you know your friend Nick Pope by any chance?
I do know him, actually. I spoke to him on his first day in his job in the ministry, and it's quite interesting because I was in touch. I've been on this since, as you said in your introduction, since my 20s, and I was on the radio at the age of 22 in the 70s on this topic. So I was on to his department before he got there. I was with his predecessor. And then when he got there on his first day, I gave him a call to welcome him to his department. And that's the UFO department, by the way, in the Ministry of Defense, which has now closed in 2009. That's another disgrace over here. But I said to him, Dick, do you believe in UFOs? And he said, not particularly, no. I said, well, you will do. And look at him now.
And look at him now. Exactly. He's all over the place.
But, you know, he has to be said, and we're perfectly friendly when we do come across each other, but he was part of that cover-up. I mean, he was in there, and as I'm assuming, I don't know this, that he's still under the Official Secrets Act now, because usually they are, even if they leave the job. He's not a whistleblower anywhere near the caliber of the three people that were there, especially David Grush. But certainly he's got a lot to say on the topic. And the one thing where perhaps I would part company with him and some others is that I think, I could be wrong, but I think is still open to the idea that they could be hostile, that they could pose a threat.
Right. They seem very concerned about that.
They do. Well, do you know, it's an interesting thing. Before my time in the Aetherius Society, there's a journal that we still have, actually, called Cosmic Voice. And in 1958, this journal, Cosmic Voice, was published, and there was a warning in there, in print, in an editorial, that when these things are brought out, when they are revealed, and as it was said that they would be, then they will start to put out the narrative, not the word narrative, but that was what they meant, the narrative, that they are hostile, and that's happening. I don't know whether you caught the news, but in the press over here, we're told that about 3 days before the hearing, Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, who's head of what they call the AARO, right, the All-Domain Anomalous Resolution Office. What a name for a UFO department. Anyway, he came out and said that he's having sleepless nights worrying about extraterrestrial invasion. That was reported over here in some papers. So, I mean, that's all part of it. And, of course, that suits the agenda, I'd have to say, of some in the Pentagon and some in ministries of defense around the world, because then it's an excuse to build up their armaments.
What got you involved in UFOs, Richard?
I was at university in the north of England, not far from where I am actually now. I'm in the north of England talking to you now, in a county, a beautiful county, Yorkshire, and actually where Dr. King came from. But I had a fantastic sighting, and in those days, you probably remember, George, they were always called either flying saucers or cigar-shaped objects. You remember? And then they come with all these names, don't they? Do you know, I actually found, when I wrote my book on UFOs, I found reference in an 11th century Japanese document to a UFO sighting being described as an earthenware vessel. So it wasn't even new. The flying saucer term wasn't even new. But that's aside. I was at a university in a place called Hull, and we had a fantastic sighting. But, I mean, not just me, hundreds. I think it was about 500 people saw this, and it was moving slowly across the sky with this, cigar, oblong shape, tubular shape, you might say. And it got obscured at one point by an oak tree, because I drove out with a friend and we watched it from a field, and then it became visible again, moving really quite slowly, and then it disappeared. And I do remember the professor at the university, I think it was the professor of chemistry, I believe, was asked for a statement, as they used to do in those days over here, because they were absolutely determined to find a so-called expert to disprove or discount or debunk UFOs all the time. And he came out in the local press anyway and said it was a barium cloud. He wasn't an expert on UFOs at all. He just worked in a chemistry department. And then they found out there's no such thing as a barium cloud. And if there was, it wouldn't operate like this object. And then I sort of thought, okay, we've got UFOs. We've also got cover-up going on. And then I got into it and I found just how bad and how dishonest the cover-up was over here. And then, of course, in America, they were overtly lying. I think they've admitted it now, just blatantly lying about this topic.
Let's analyze some of the discussions of the three who spoke before Congress. Let's start with David Grush, who said that our government, the American government, has retrieved an alien spacecraft. What do you think of that?
It's very interesting, isn't it? Because, I mean, obviously I have no inside knowledge on how true that is. But, I mean, I can't see any reason why a man like that, who, as you rightly say, was always very careful to obey the law and didn't comment on things he wasn't legally allowed to comment on and said, this is secret, we'll have to meet secretly and so forth. Why on earth he would come out and say that if it wasn't true? He's got no reason to. It's extremely damaging to his career. He claimed that he was actually physically harmed and implied even that his wife may have been in some way endangered by him doing this. That was one of the themes, wasn't it? The way people are being harmed who speak out on this issue. And so I think it's very, very interesting. And it's very interesting to us over here, actually, George, because the first one, he said, actually was in Europe, in Italy in 1933.
Mussolini's government, right?
Exactly, Mussolini. When he was ruling Italy with his dictatorship, they had a retrieved spacecraft. And then when he was defeated at the end of the war, thanks to the Americans, really, then apparently, this is really fascinating, the Pope, Pius XII, intervened and made sure that this spacecraft that they had in their Air Force over there was taken to America. And that's the first one that David Grush knows of at all. Actually, there is one I know of that's a lot older than that was retrieved. And that's the oldest document, I think, on Earth, which is the Ramayana, Vedic script, Hindus, and that's called the Pushpaka Vimana. And that was retrieved from Sri Lanka, as it is now, it's called Sri Lanka now, and taken back to the Himalayas, according to that book. But that's going a long way back, George.
Now, also, Grush talked about biologics. What do you think he meant by that, Richard?
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, I've got a theory. It's only my opinion. If they retrieve biologics, which one assumes they call them non-human personnel or some word like that, in my opinion, George, that would be robotic. In other words, it might appear to and this is only I don't know this, if that's true, and he said he hadn't witnessed that. When he was asked whether he'd witnessed had certain knowledge of the spacecraft being retrieved, he wouldn't comment. When it came to the biologics, he said that's what he'd been told. So it sounds like he knows about the craft and he's been told about the biologics. But in my opinion, again, I don't believe that an alien... I mean, I think one of the congressmen actually said, look, it's a bit far-fetched to think they've got this technology, which is so outstanding, with incredible acceleration, even power of invisibility, or what you might call multidimensional existence. That, to me, was one of the most interesting moments in the whole hearing. The reference to quasi-dimensional intelligences coming down from a higher dimension to a lower one. That's really, I think, groundbreaking. But anyway, coming back to the biologics, this congressman said, well, how is it that they have all this capability and yet they crash? And the answer to that must be, as far as I'm concerned, is because they don't really crash, they just appear to crash, or they are allowed to crash. I don't think they would allow alien entities to be captured, but they might allow, again, my opinion, robotic creatures, non-human, what we might call biologics, which might appear to us to be so sophisticated that they are biological, but in fact they are some kind of created intelligences that they're allowing people on Earth, in the American government or the Pentagon or wherever, to try and investigate it. They're trying to do reverse engineering, aren't they? But apparently, from what we can glean, not very successfully.
They could be cyborgs, too, part biological, part machine.
That's true as well, yeah. Sort of grown, as it were, deliberately grown. Yeah, I could see that, but I think it'll all be what they want, because you know what it's like, and you've been doing this, I don't know whether it's longer than me, George, but you've been on this forever, but as I have, and there used to be, didn't there, the nuts and bolts flying saucer person or ufologist, and the more spiritually inclined one. Actually, the two have come together more now. But there are people who say, okay, there are sightings, there are radar tracking, there is film, there is, military witnesses. And let's remember, this is estimated to be about 5%, according to one of the three gentlemen, 5% of the real military sightings of craft is the ones that are reported. He was saying he thinks 95% aren't even reported by military personnel because it's so damaging to their careers to report it. So we're talking here, we aren't even looking at what the public are experiencing out there. This is purely military personnel working for the American government.
Were you surprised by the hearing, the fact that they went ahead and did it?
I was, actually, and the one thing already back in 2021, and you and I have talked about this, they virtually as good as said that UFOs exist, having denied it forever. And well done. Congratulations have got to be given, by the way, to the American government. I mean, I've just got a thing, and I don't know how interesting this is to your listeners, but just like an hour ago, from the UK government here, and we have a science committee here, stating they've got no plans to investigate flying saucers, even though the US Congress inquiry has captured the imagination. The UK government doesn't spend any money, they're claiming, on R&D, research and development, into unidentified flying objects. That's just come out. And the House of Commons, that's what we have over here, a bit like your House of Representatives, Science, Innovation and Technology Committee, said it had no existing or planned work on the issue, and the Ministry of Defense over here, like your Pentagon, said it ceased to investigate reports of UFOs or UAP in 2009. There is no change on that, and basically the final arbiter here, the UK Space Agency, said, we don't fund anything looking into UFOs. They just look into the possibility of life on Mars, and that they actually referred the questions to each other, all these various departments, and you never get anywhere. So was I surprised? Yes, I was, to a degree. The big question to me was, will they come out and admit now that they're extraterrestrial? And certainly the three witnesses made that very clear. And I think it looked to me like quite a few of the congressmen and women were thinking that too. We need that now to be officially confirmed by Pentagon bodies and by the government. And then we need the other governments to get off their backsides and really get out there and start being honest with the public.
Do you think fallen angels might have been extraterrestrials that the Bible refers to?
That's very, very interesting. I think it's possible. I think it's possible also it's a reference to meteorites, actually, too. I mean, like Lucifer you're referring to, I
yes,
take it there.
That's
the
right.
fallen angels. Yeah. I think it is. I think that, let's first of all say the Bible is an absolutely jam-packed book of UFOs. Apart from everything else, that's not in any way to denigrate the religious beliefs of Jewish or Christian people. Not at all. Doesn't. In fact, it adds to it. I think your great representative over there, Tim Burchett, I think he's a Baptist, but at the same time, he's I've heard him being explicit that Ezekiel was very much a UFO witness and contactee.
Richard, one of the other members of the former military that spoke at the congressional hearing, Commander David Fravor, what do you think of his testimony?
Extremely credible. Absolutely. I've heard him described as like, gold standard witness. I mean, he's very hard to deny. He had nothing to gain from this. It wasn't a particular interest of his before he experienced it. He said he reported his sightings to senior officers. They did nothing about it at all. And some of the things that he said they witnessed, I mean, some of these he said in Congress, and some he and others have said out of it, such as the ability to move abruptly, the ability to move at considerable speed without discernible means of propulsion. I mean, they don't have wings, these craft, which amazes anyone in the Air Force, really, how they're propelled at all. Sudden and instantaneous acceleration, hypersonic velocities without signatures, and signatures, of course, means some detect. So, for example, they can go through the sound barrier without a sonic boom. By the way, some of these things, as I mentioned earlier, were published in 1996 in a book called Contacts with the Gods from Space by Dr. George King and myself. Is now in a new edition. And we actually, in that book, and people can check me out on this, we talked about the fact that atmospheric friction could be controlled and avoided, that gravity could be controlled. We went into some detail about how these craft can control gravity and talked about invisibility, which is one of the things that led to this higher dimensional point, I think, that was raised later with David Grush, that they see these craft disappear in front of their eyes. They're tracking them on radar. Commander Fravor, coming back to your question, said that no enemy, and I think this is a key point, because do you remember it always used to be said, well, this must be Chinese or Russian, these things. He said no enemy has this capability. I mean, that has been said before.
They would have used it by now.
They would have used it. I mean, they don't have the type of technology. I come back to something I said before. Commander Fravor said, it's physics beyond anything we know physics to be on Earth. They have these supernormal capabilities, as you rightly say. Do we think there'd be a war in Ukraine now if Russia had these, craft, this capability? And likewise, China, which many people think has an agenda, would we be even discussing it? That brings us, by the way, to the hostile alien point. As it was published in 1958 in Cosmic Voice by the Aetherius Society, if they were hostile, we would not exist. There's the proof.
No doubt. Now, what did you think of Ryan Graves, one of the pilots who witnessed the Tic Tac videos?
Yeah, I had quite a lot of sympathy with him. I mean, he said he was actually speaking on behalf of 30 others who have personally witnessed UFOs, but he also went on to say he thinks only 5% of his colleagues actually report their cast iron experiences that they're having. The majority of witnesses, he said, that are making these reports are pilots, veterans of flying experience. Their sightings are kept classified, they're kept secret. He said that Pentagon programs investigating UFOs have evaded oversight. I think that's a very interesting thing. And it led to one of, in a way, the most sinister things about the whole hearing, I think certainly from a political point of view, that one was left wondering, really, who is running the American government on UFOs, at least, on UAPs? It's the military. I mean, some of these congressmen and women said they weren't being told things themselves, these elected representatives, by the Pentagon, because the Pentagon officials were telling them their security classification was too low. So they themselves weren't being told things. Never mind us, the general public out there. But I do, every time I sort of criticize the Americans, I must say they are streets ahead of the British, where I'm speaking to you from, who are absolutely desultory. They are really absent from duty. It's completely and utterly pathetic, and their excuses are about as convincing as something that's very, very unconvincing. I couldn't think of anything to say there, George, but it really is. Anyway, sorry, coming back to Graves, yes, he said that officials in and out of government have determined authorization to have access to data, classified information, that there, and this is a key point, there is an active disinformation campaign about UFO disclosure, and a multi-decade campaign to disenfranchise public interest. Of course, the big weapon that was used and still is used sometimes with the public is ridicule. It used to be religious prejudice, but as I mentioned earlier, now even sort of Baptists like.
Well, that's why so many pilots stayed quiet, because they were a fear of being ridiculed.
Absolutely. And one positive, let's have another positive, did seem to be universally agreed in that meeting that the stigma has gone. I don't think it's gone in this country and certain other countries, but they were saying that the stigma has gone, although that is juxtaposed against this thing that the military feel their careers can be ruined if they come forward. And David Grush was talking about some quite sinister things that happened to him. And he even didn't rule out people being killed, witnesses. So that wasn't all going that way. But it does seem, I mean, there's an article came out in Forbes not very long ago. I don't know whether you caught it, I think last week, saying that basically it used to be taboo and it's no longer, it's now mainstream. Although you, coast to coast, I mean, all power to you and to your previously to Art Bell, you've been on this way ahead of the mainstream. So well done for that, George.
They laughed at us, but they don't laugh anymore, Richard.
Yes, the laugh's on the other side of their face right now.
Exactly.
And, you know, that's a funny thing for me, too, because I was out there a lot in the 80s over here and in America, actually. I came over, you remember I don't know whether you remember the Japanese airline, JAL, sightings that were covered up.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
The FAA were forced. Yeah, I was a part of that campaign to get them to do that over in America. So I was campaigning, but I do remember the days when you were laughed at for saying the governments are lying. You know, if you said there's a conspiracy, you were thought of as a total nutter at one time, if you can use that word anymore. I'm not sure. But you were really, really ridiculed, pilloried for coming out and saying there are government cover-ups and regarded as a really stupid person. Now, George, if I go out now and say, by the way, you know, governments tell you the truth, I'd be laughed out of the room.
That's right.
Nobody believes governments now. But that was, and for me, people are much, much more skeptical about governments than they are about UFOs.
How do you feel our Congress people handled the hearing?
I was impressed. Actually, I wish we had some politicians like yours. As I said, this breaking story this morning over here that the House of Science, the House of Commons Science Committee and Technology Committee are not covering it, shows the caliber of the politicians here. I think you've got some very gutsy men and women over there. And what I've heard, I don't know whether this is true, you would know better than me, this is about the only thing which is bipartisan in Congress right now. They're Democrats and Republicans completely uniting on this one issue, just a few of them, but nevertheless they are uniting. And so I thought they handled it very well, actually.
What comes next, in your opinion, Richard?
Well, I think we have to tackle two things, really. We have to tackle the friendly issue, because that's going to be used. And it serves the Pentagon well, of course, in that way, because if they can they can sort of, I hate to say this, but turn it to their advantage. As I mentioned earlier, it was very clear the military are running the government, not the government running the military on this issue in America. And that was not disputed, I don't think, by anybody in the room, including the congressmen and women. And that is what you think of as a sort of fascist dictatorship, really. That'd be more like the Mussolini times than a modern democracy. And so I think the danger is the Pentagon, for one, and it could happen elsewhere, could use it as an excuse to build up their armament. So there's a hostile threat here. We need to invest more in weaponry. And that's, I think, part of what used to be called the silence group. I think now it's often called deep state. I think even President Trump, talked about deep state. And after all, it was he who got the ball rolling, really, right at the end of his tenure and brought about the hearing, not the hearing, but the first release in 2021. Now it's a Democrat initiative from Senator Schumer, which is a great thing. So I think that's a danger. I think we have to tackle that, and surely it must be obvious they're friendly. All these demonstrations talked about by Commander Fravor, Ryan Graves, and many other, several other military witnesses show their capabilities. And all we have is evidence of their being friendly. We don't have any evidence at all of hostility. And why would they be? This is not a new, I always come back to this, but it's very important, I think. This is not a new phenomenon. They've been with us for thousands of years. And there, as we've mentioned the Bible, the Hindu script, but it's in the Greek legends, it's right South American legends, it's across the board, even Chinese, different cultures have witnessed these things in one form or another. I mean, what was Pegasus? It wasn't a horse. That was a flying vehicle. The Star of Bethlehem, definitely a flying vehicle. It can't have been a star, and so on. One can go on and on. So I think it's obvious they're friendly. So that's one thing. And then I think the other important thing is that people need to look at those people who claim contacts. Now, you and I have talked before at length about Dr. George King, who I believe to be a contactee. I know we're not covering that in the show today.
That's okay, from the 1950s.
Sorry?
He was from the 1950s.
Yeah, he started out in 1955. He actually had a rally in Trafalgar Square, which is one of our main centres in London, in 1958, calling on governments to tell the truth about UFOs, to some of the things that are happening now. 65 years ago he was on that. He also claimed to be a contactee. There are other claimants. I don't believe many of them, I have to say. There's very few that I would personally believe. But I think that's the next step. You know, I use this image, really, George, of the Bhagavad Gita. Let's just take that as an example. I'm not putting forward any particular religion here at all, but this is believed in by many millions, possibly billions of people around the world. This was delivered in the ancient days by Sri Krishna in a chariot, for those who don't know, with Arjuna, he was driving, who was a prince. And he delivered this text, which has been followed by millions and millions of people for thousands of years, called the Bhagavad Gita. And it would be rather like him arriving in his chariot, and there were sort of film crews and media personnel, and he was delivering, this great godlike being, delivering some of the greatest wisdom ever delivered to earth in his chariot, and all they reported on was the chariot and the wheels and the capability of that chariot and how fast it could move and how it could do corners. Instead of the person in it and the wisdom was delivering. So I do think people now, surely all this is leading up to, like, who are they? What is their message? You have to discriminate carefully. I mean, let me be the first to say there's a lot of nonsense out there and a lot of some well-meaning beliefs that I personally wouldn't subscribe to, but there are genuine ones too. I mean, I came across a man, George, back in 1997 called Sir Peter Horsley, who was the equerry to Prince Philip, the late Prince Philip, husband of the late Queen here, who actually met an alien in 1954, and he told me about it after he retired. Now, he was the number 2 he was an air marshal. He had his finger on the nuclear button over here. He was knighted. He was right at the top of the air ministry, I think the number 2 position in it. He didn't reveal it while he was there. Another one who, like, I suppose, people like Nick Pope when he was there and others, didn't reveal it, unlike David Grush, who's come forward, by the way, well done him, but he did reveal it when he retired to the Bahamas, Bermuda, wherever, one of those two, and so I spoke to him on the phone, and it was actually, we got it on the front page of the biggest selling newspaper in Britain, which is called The Sun, at the time, but he actually said that he met an alien. Now, I believe him. He had no reason to make this up. He was extremely credible. So there are genuine cases. And the message that he received, which I've detailed, I think, exclusively in my book, is aligned much with some of the messages received through the years by Dr. George King. So there are genuine people through the decades. That's where we need to go now and look into those, and then we'll get the real wisdom and the purpose and the whys and the wherefores of these incredible capabilities of their craft.
Richard, were you familiar with the work of the late Zecharia Sitchin?
I know of him. I wouldn't claim to be anything near. I'm sure you know a lot more than I do about him, but he's an interesting gentleman, isn't he?
He claimed that a race of extraterrestrials called the Anunnaki came here from another planet that circles it's in our solar system, but it comes around every 3,600 years. But he claims that they seeded whatever life might have been on this planet at the time and created us.
Yes, indeed, yes. Anunnaki, I think they're extremely interesting and very convincing. What I say, I'm no expert on it. I think I caught you mentioning this solar system, which I think is very significant because most claimants are looking out to, they claim, Sirius or the Pleiades or some distant constellation. And, of course, it's going to be the intelligences in this solar system who are going to have the greatest interest in our development here. I'm not saying all the craft come from this solar system, but if they don't come from this solar system, those within this solar system will be aware of them and will be controlling movement and so forth. So I think that is, that's where we really come up, I think, George, to the higher dimensional point that David Grush made to Representative Eric Burleson.
Does the Rendlesham case come up out in your neck of the woods much?
It does come up, yes. That's a good point. And I was on the phone to them when it was first revealed in Parliament, which was, I think, in '83 over here in a question in Parliament. I phoned the base, and during my conversation with the base, it was classified. So the woman talking away was starting to talk to me about it. And then in the midstream, she had to say, actually, I can't say any more. And that was the end of that. But no, it's a big case, and Margaret Thatcher is believed to have known about it and is believed to have said, you've got to get your facts right, but you can't tell the people. And that's according to one journalist who knew her and had a conversation with her and wrote a book all about it. So it's covered in my book, and it's certainly it's not quite Roswell, but it's that kind of stature over in Britain.
Overall, what do you think of the UFO phenomena? What do you think's happening?
Well, I think, and this is the point, I think two main things are happening. I think the extraterrestrial intelligences who are interested in this Earth, they're interested enough to obviously, as it would seem, play around with craft. I mean, according to Graves, one of the witnesses, UAPs, as they now call them, have been seen in all areas where the U.S. Navy is operational. In all areas, he said. And Commander Fravor is as senior as it gets, really. He said UAPs are definitely not from this Earth. And if they'd been hostile, we wouldn't have been able to defend ourselves. So they are obviously doing this deliberately. They may have even allowed them to retrieve craft deliberately, and it's all leading up to people sort of getting off their backsides, really, and finding out the truth of the message. And this is why my book's called UFOs and the Extraterrestrial Message. If it was just UFOs, as I said earlier, it would just be about a craft. It would just be like talking about Sri Krishna's chariot instead of his wisdom. It's got to be about the message and the beings within it. And for that, you have to look at the claimants. And I just leave people to form their own conclusions. I try to keep, certainly my website, which is richardlawrence.co.uk, keeps the sort of latest developments. And people can look at those, and they can look elsewhere and then form their own conclusions. It's really up to them. I do think this, though. I also think that what's come out here is an attempt by government to control, always to control the agenda. And I think that's because the governments either don't have these answers as to what their message is and why they're here, or they don't want us to have them. It's one or the other. And so they don't want people looking elsewhere. That's why, because people say, well, why have they covered up? It's not just America. There are programs going on in Russia and China, it's been revealed, of a similar nature within their governments. Say Britain is a joke, but that's if, they're telling the truth, which is very unlikely, I would say, because we know they've lied. We know that Winston Churchill himself was lied to about flying saucers. That's come out under our Public Records Act by his science advisor. So if prime ministers get lied to, Bill Clinton has come out and said he couldn't get to the bottom of Roswell. Nobody really told him. And Obama doesn't seem to know. He knows they're there, the UFOs exist. He never really got proper answers. There's something going on, and there's people behind the scenes, behind governments even, who don't want us to know. So I think the next step is for people to make the effort. And there's one positive message I would put out. I do believe that every step we take towards them, they will take two towards us. They, the extraterrestrials. If governments are allowed to hide the craft they've been given, then, and we let them, then they can't come much closer. They won't interfere with us. That's my personal conclusion. That's the view of the Aetherius Society. But if we are proactive, if we make an effort, if we look into it, we will find the truth.
Or they would have done something to us a long time ago, Richard.
So true. So true. And all you can see from the records, you can go to Elijah, definitely you can go to Moses, and as I mentioned, you can go to the Star of Bethlehem, and you can go to the Buddhists have great texts as well on this.
How about the miracle of Fatima?
Exactly. That's an incredible case, is it not? Miracle of Fatima. This is, I'm not going to say every great miraculous spiritual happening is linked to UFOs. I think that's another mistake that can get made. Also on the negative side, with people's unpleasant experiences, they attribute it to aliens when it may well not be aliens at all. And very often I think it isn't. So you've got, I'm sorry to say, you've got great angelic forces. You've got the opposite, and I know you cover that quite a bit on your show. Yes. And so they might even pretend to be alien intelligences, just like at one time they were all pretending to be, ascended masters and bodhisattvas 100 years ago. Some of these interfering forces, you can get that, and that's just a shame. But again, I'm very confident. People apply their intelligence, their logic, their open-mindedness. They will get to the truth.
What do you think the next step is? So we have this congressional hearing. What happens next?
I think the next step, I gather there are already more whistleblowers being lined up. I think they need to confirm, because we have clear evidence from the witnesses, and it seems a lot of the congressmen and women, at least, were on the same page as them. But we do need the government officially now to come out and confirm some of these things. Yes, UFOs exist, and yes, some of them are extraterrestrial. I mean, Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, who runs the AARO, the All Domain, I've got to keep remembering this, Anomaly Resolution Office, he has basically said they're looking at 5%. I think he's looking at 800 sightings, alongside the fact that he says he's lying awake at night worrying about extraterrestrial invasion, which I don't believe, by the way, at all, but that's what he's saying. Or if he is, he's very misguided. But he's looking at these 800 people. I think there's another thing I would say here, actually, George, that isn't it strange that where governments do get involved in this, it's generally their ministries of defense.
Yes.
It's not the communications department or some other department or even, education department. It's the Ministry of Defense. So the people who work there are programmed to be looking for hostility before they even start. And it's not ideal at all. But I do think, anyway, they need to come out more officially now from a higher level, and also other governments. And I must say it over and over again, well done, the American democracy, for enabling an activity like this. But it does need to go a lot further, and it needs to have more high-level official people coming out, not after they retire, like Obama and Clinton, not just that, while they're in office. That's where it needs to go next.
Where do people get your books that were written several years ago, weren't they?
Yeah, well, the UFOs and the Extraterrestrial Message came out in a new edition 3 years ago, and that's obviously on Amazon, but you can get all the information from my website, which is richardlawrence.co.uk. The other book I mentioned, Contacts with the Gods from Space, which was written with Dr. George King, late Dr. George King, who, as you well know, I believe, was a genuine contactee. I knew him very, very well indeed, a personal friend as well as a great mentor to me. You get that from, again, Amazon, my website, but also from the Aetherius Society. And the website there is aetherius.org. That's AETHERIUS.org.
Was Dr. George King an associate first or a friend?
He was first a teacher, because as well as being a UFO contactee, he was a master of yoga, and I was very, very into yoga practice. He was a great proponent of a thing called pranayama, which I was diligently practicing when I first went to university, before I had a UFO sighting, actually. So I was aware of him then. As a matter of fact, this is a strange thing, so forgive me, it's a bit of an off-the-wall story, this, but I had a choice, because I was also a very keen player of squash, the game squash, which is a bit like, I think, racquetball over there, and in an indoor court. And so, being a student, I didn't have much money, and I remember I had a choice to make, which was to buy some of the books by Dr. King, or to buy some gym shoes to play squash. And I couldn't do both, so I chose the books. And this was just before I had this sighting. So when I drove out with my good friend John Holder, and we're still very good friends to this day, and we both witnessed this. We had a battered-up old car. We drove out to this field. We walked across it. And it was actually a dew, laden with dew, or wet. It was wet field. And we walked across, and I mentioned earlier, it was a cigar-shaped object. At one point it was... it disappeared from view because there was a big oak tree out there in the middle of this field. And underneath the oak tree, as it disappeared, there was a dry piece of ground. And on that dry piece of ground was a brand new pair of gym shoes, George. And it was my son.
How does this happen?
Sorry?
How does that happen?
Well, exactly. I mean, they weren't made on Mars. They were like from Dunlop or Slazenger or some make. But I picked them up, and they were my size. They fitted. And then I looked up again, and the UFO was visible again. So it was just one of those things, what you might call a synchronicity. And I thought, this is interesting because, there's an old sort of saying in yoga, which is what you reject is laid at your feet. And I'd rejected these gym shoes. But in this case, actually, they were worn on my feet. But that was an interesting thing that happened there. But anyway, that's a small story. But the main thing is that I got into that, there was a concurrence then between Dr. George King's books and UFOs. And so I went on, and he was, as I say, became a mentor, a teacher. And later we became very firm. I would say for the last 20 years of his life, we spoke every day, either on the phone or in person, that close.
And didn't Grush say that his life was threatened?
He did, and he even seemed to suggest, well, when he was asked whether anyone had been killed who was a witness, he refused to answer. And that's where, said these things need to be discussed. I think they call it SHIF, in some secret committee, some secret operation. The public can't know. So, yeah, he did. And he kind of intimated his wife had been affected as well, and that he knew of other cases. This is, of course, denied, but then it would be denied.
You've been at this for a long, long time, my friend. What's next for you?
I have. I don't know whether it's longer than you or not, George, but certainly since the 70s, when I was at university onwards, I've been on this, and I've seen a massive change. I mean, on the plus side, certainly in Britain and in America. But I mean, I remember going over, actually, and talking at MUFON meetings and being in touch with MUFON over there in the 80s, and then going back in the 2000s when my book first came out. It's a new edition now. And there's been a massive change within the movement as well, actually. And there were some MUFON organizers in certain parts who were very honest about that with me and said, look, I personally don't particularly like the spiritual aspect of this topic, but I do acknowledge, and we acknowledge, it's part of the UFO movement now, whether I like it or not, and therefore we want to hear about it. And that's a very open-minded approach, whereas at one time, as I'm sure you'll remember, it was either your nuts and bolts or you're spiritual. And I've always been on the spiritual end of things, but I'm also interested in the technical side that came out in the hearing. I think where we go from here is I just see it as my job to make the information available as widely as I can on great shows like this one. I'm doing a lot over here, a lot of television. People can catch a lot of it on my website, and they've set up a TikTok channel. I don't know whether TikTok is really approved in America too much for everyone. But anyway, I've got a team here, and they've done a great job, and got a channel on TikTok for those who are on TikTok. And just getting it out, not converting anybody at all, not convincing anyone of any particular thing, but just sharing the knowledge. And now we have a climate where the stigma is going and where the media are changing. There's some progress to be made on that front in Britain, but I've had extremely open interviews here in the last few weeks, far better than I would have had 30 years ago.
Richard, take a bit, 30 seconds or so. Tell us where we can get your books and about your website.
So my website is richardlawrence.co.uk, and you'll find a TikTok link there if you're on TikTok as well. The Aetherius Society, of which I've been secretary for over 40 years over here in Europe now, that's at Aetherius, AETHERIUS.org, and there are a lot of headquarters and branches and groups of that in America and Canada, where I know you're broadcasting, as well as other parts of the world too. And do get in touch with us. If I can answer any of your questions you haven't been able to get over on the show, just contact me, richard@richardlawrence.co.uk.
Richard, would love you as a guest. Stay in touch with us. If anything breaks, jump back on, would you?
I'd love to. Thank you so much, George, and thanks for all you're doing as well.
Richard Lawrence, he just does a great job. Let me give you the title of a couple of his books, UFOs and the Extraterrestrial Message, and the other is Contact with the Gods from Space, that he did with Dr. George King many years ago as well. The Coast mobile app is now available for download on iPhones and Android devices. You can become an insider directly through this app. This is a great option for our international listeners, and new users will also receive a free 2-week trial.